All right, good afternoon. Why don't we go ahead and get started? My name is Damon Wilson. I'm Executive Vice President at the Atlantic Council, and I'm delighted to be here at Globsec and delighted to welcome you to what is our final session here for the conference. But being the final session, I think this is also one of the most important, and it provides a trajectory for a discussion of the way forward. Our session today, In Need of a Compass, the New Middle East and North Africa. It captures one of the most important issues that I think faces the transatlantic community, and that is the historic transitions, the historic transformation that's taking place essentially in Europe's periphery, just across the Mediterranean. It was on December 17th, 2010, just 2+ years ago, that Tarek al-Tayyab Mohammed Bouaziz set himself ablaze in Tunis, kicking off what has become a pretty dramatic transformation all across the region. 2.5 years, not even 2.5 years later, we have new governments, new forms of governments in Tunisia and Egypt, now in Yemen as well. After a war in Libya, a new government there. We're in the midst of an incredible conflict in Syria today that is testing the moral, political, and strategic interests of our community. And you have change percolating throughout societies elsewhere in the region. And this isn't a region that's distant. This is on Europe's border. Part of what we want to get into this afternoon as we wrap up our conference here is whether the United States and Europe, whether the Atlantic community, whether they're playing the right supporting role in assisting the Arab states, these Arab societies that are experiencing transition towards becoming more pluralistic, perhaps even democratic, and ultimately more liberal societies. That is convergence between Europe and its neighborhood in North Africa and the Middle East. At the Atlantic Council, we actually launched the Rafiq Hariri Center 2 years ago precisely to address this issue, because we felt that this issue of the transformation in the region of North Africa and the Middle East was such a compelling issue for the transatlantic agenda that we had such a historic window of opportunity to think about our policies for the region, to play the right supporting role in the historic transition, and we were concerned that we were not getting it right. Were we missing an opportunity to refashion our relationships with the region and help foster this convergence over the long term, recognizing that there'll be enormous short-term challenges on the path to a long-term transition in the region. To guide us through this conversation today, we have 3 terrific experts on the stage. To my right, beginning with Ambassador MARC PIERINI, a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe. His research there focuses on the Middle East and Europe. But he served as a career EU diplomat, as a diplomat for the European Union, serving as ambassador almost as if to each country in the region, to Turkey, to Tunisia, Libya, Syria, Morocco. He also served as the first coordinator for the European Mediterranean Partnership, otherwise known as the Barcelona process, and something very appropriate given his hometown of Marseille. To my left, NAJIB GHADBIAN, who represents the Syrian opposition representative to the United States. He's been a Syrian activist, an academic, serves as an associate professor at the University of Arkansas, was an early signatory of the Damascus Declaration in 2005 and a founding member of the Syrian National Council. He's published 2 books focusing on issues of democracy and Islam in the Arab world and on the Assad regime in particular. He's been an outspoken voice in Washington on behalf of the National Coalition of the Syrian Revolution and opposition forces. And further to my left, TAREK OSMAN, an Egyptian political economist and writer who divides his time between London and Cairo, currently serving with the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, as the political counselor focused on the southern and eastern Mediterranean. He's the author of a book, Egypt on the Brink, which came out just 2 months before the revolution in Egypt, and that year was named as one of the most important books by Foreign Policy. He's had a focus on geostrategy and the social politics of the Arab world. So to kick off our discussion, I want to turn to you, Ambassador. You've served across the region. You've helped shape and fashion European Union policy to the region through all of your career. And I wondered if you could help us set the scene. The ambassador authored one of the policy briefs that many of you received as part of the conference here. And I think it was entitled, Are We on the Same Page? So yes, we need to cooperate with this region of great proximity and importance to Europe. But are Europe and actors in the region coming at these issues from fundamentally different places and is cooperation towards a common purpose possible? So Ambassador, please kick us off.
Thank you. Well, I think if we look back in 1995, we back then, as you mentioned, had a policy called the Barcelona Process, or the Euro-Med Partnership, which had the peculiarity of being crafted through dialogue for over a year with the countries in the region. That was implemented successfully in some parts, without so much success in other parts. And then, of course, September 11 at 2001 was a sort of watershed. But today, the situation that we have in the Middle East, and especially with Egypt and Tunisia, is first of all a lesson in modesty. Not only we didn't see it coming, not only we had no influence into it, but we're not sure today that we fully grasp what's happening. We fully grasp the economics of it. Tunisia, Egypt, of course, Morocco, Jordan, these countries are still hooked to the EU in economic terms. Export, imports, tourism, and of course, foreign direct investment. That is primarily the EU to a very, very vast majority. So the governments in these countries don't have much of a choice to continue cooperating with Europe or with the West in general. But there is a democratic paradox. We have seen popular revolutions, certainly in Cairo and Tunis, but we have seen elections after a while, bringing regimes that are perhaps, some say, equally intolerant as the dictatorships they have replaced. We have, for example, in Tunisia, an attempt by some deputies in Ada, and I would recall that in Tunisia we have a constituent assembly at the moment, trying to reform the constitution by removing the words that say the woman is the equal of the man and replacing the equal by the complement. Well, that's a massive change. It failed at this point, but that's one of the question marks. In Egypt, you have drafts of a new NGO law, which seems to be at least as severe as the one used under Mubarak. Critics say that under the Muslim Brotherhood there is as much torture as under Mubarak. So the point is not the anecdotal evidence. The point is that we have certainly ballot box democracy at work, and this is fairly legitimate because quite a substantial part of the opinion in these countries was suppressed, therefore they want to express themselves through elections. But we do not have a civil society dialogue. Therefore, dissent is not really taken into account, and we are, for the moment, I'm stressing for the moment, heading towards majoritarian democracy, and not a democracy as we in the West or as in Europe we would want to see. So there are question marks. Is there a choice to walk away? Of course not. The first priority for Europe, for the US as well, is certainly to better understand, to engage and to dialogue with the Islamist forces that have a strong minority in the system. The second priority is, of course, retooling our policies, shifting our toolbox towards more civil society support to the media, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the third priority is to seek clarifications on these subjects where we seem to have major differences. Civil society is one, the role of women is another one, free media is another one. These are only examples. But I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That's a good way to kick off the conversation. Given that context, let me turn first to Tarek. Tarek, we've talked a little bit about your interest in your work in the institutions that need to be built and the societies that are going through transition in the Arab world. We've just heard from the Ambassador a situation of potential concern or potential skepticism that we may have ballot box democracy, but without a civil society, without the institutions that could lead to a majoritarian democracy without respect to minorities, other views. Given your work in Egypt, do you think that's an accurate assessment? Do you think that we're running a dangerous course of, I think he said, if I captured it right, almost an equally intolerant situation today as in the past. And what do we do about this?
I think there's a focus, especially in Europe, on the political transition to a large extent. So there's a focus on the elections, of course, on the constitutions and certain articles in the constitution. That's, of course, extremely important. There's also the focus, as Mr. Ambassador said, on the economic side of things. In Egypt, in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Jordan, in other places, there are massive budgetary deficits, and they are very politically related because the number one expense in all of these budgets are food and energy subsidies that effectively make the vast majority of the people in these countries able to live. Without these subsidies, you have a major, not just economic, but social problem. So of course, there's a focus on these two elements. But before touching on the point that you raised, I want to put forward the social dimension that I think many people have in the back of their minds, but not necessarily put forward clearly. And I think that relates to 2 points. The first one is the demographic element. And I know some friends here probably have heard me saying that before, but for me it is the real story, not just in Egypt, in the entire Arab world. If you take Egypt as an example, when I was born, Egypt was 45 million people. Today it's 80 million people, 85 million people. So it doubled its population in 35 to 40 years, and the bulk of that is in their teens today. The Arab world in general, in the mid to late 70s, was anything between 180 to 200 million. Today, it's approaching 350 million. Same story. And because the education system in the Arab world leaves much to be desired, and because the exposure to the world also has been relatively limited, except in the past 10, 15 years because of satellite channels and the internet and what have you, to a very large extent, the ambiance, the social ambiance in which this new generation that has been growing is not necessarily the one that you are seeing in other places, much more connected in the world. So I just want to put that as a first point. The second point is when this generation is coming to the stage right now, the pillars upon which the states in which they are coming, be it Egypt, Tunisia, or otherwise, I think these pillars are, or have been, gradually diluted. If you take Egypt again as an example, the system that has been in power in Egypt since 1952, since the establishment of the Egyptian Republic, to a very large extent was based on the people's consent. It was never based on any democratic mandate, but basically on the people's consent, and that is some sort of a relationship in which the state takes care of the middle class, and especially the lower middle class. Over the past 10, 15 years, with the gradual but clear move towards capitalism, that has been increasingly diluted. And the second point is that the direction that the Arab world has had for at least 30 or 40 years, effectively Arab nationalism under different variations, proved to a very large extent that it is not a great solution. Complicated story, but what I'm trying to say is that this generation coming forward effectively is inheriting states. The pillars upon which they were based, whether ideologically or the social contract, are no longer there. And this generation is very young, and it's not necessarily relating to what has been before. Again, if you take Egypt, if you have 45 million people under 25 years old, they would not relate much to what has been before. So the final point, if you'd like, is the politics are dramatically important. The political economy questions, such as subsidies and how to fix budgetary deficits, very important. But the social story is dramatic. And I think this leads me to the theme of the session: what can Europe do or the West do? And I think you can get entangled into politics, and I think you'll be blamed in so many different ways, partly because of heritage and partly because of the complications on the ground. There are attempts, obviously, to help with the economic side. We are seeing now the IMF engaged with Egypt, with Tunisia, with Morocco, and with Jordan. And I think there are other programs on the ground. The European Neighborhood Facility is offering a number of support measures. But the social element, I think, is the most important one for the West, and especially for Europe. And especially for Europe that has immigration concerns, if there is a country or a region with that level of young people. What can Europe do? I'll mention the point that we had the previous chat before about, which is institutions. I think the only guarantee, maybe a bad word, the only pillar that an international stakeholder can bet on is not necessarily one political force or an upheaval in which maybe certain articles in some constitutions raise valid concerns, but the fact that there will be consistent elections, the fact that there will be rule of law and respected, the fact that there will be civil society regulations that are on international standards, the fact that constitutions will refer to and emphasize universal human rights, not what somebody thinks in Tunisia or Egypt is human rights à la Égyptien or à la Tunisien. And I think one way of doing that is to engage with these young groups. I know I didn't answer the main question, but I disagree, to be honest, with the ambassador on whether the levels of, whether the new thinking we're seeing today from Al-Nahda or the Muslim Brotherhood or the PJD in Morocco or the Islamic Action Front on the opposition in Jordan, are they equally intolerant? I think, in my view, no. But what's much more important than what a certain leader thinks here or there is that the system is effectively, and in my view, irrevocably changed. In the Arab world, not a single country almost, with the exception of Lebanon perhaps, had free elections in the past 60 years. Now we're seeing that the norm. We're seeing a new generation that really has no fear to express its views and challenge the authorities. And again, I link that to the demographic element, and that is the wave that will not stop. And I think this is more or less the guarantee of change.
Thank you, Tarek. Let me come to you, Najib. Sort of two parts to this. I mean, we've talked a little bit about how European policy, U.S. policy, legitimized oppression in the region before the Assad regime, in fact. And so if you're thinking about this in a macro sense of what Brussels and Washington can and should be doing today, how does the West act in a way that carries a degree of legitimacy, that can actually play a supporting role, given the perceptions of Western policy in the past? Play that out a little bit in the macro sense, and then specifically bring us to the situation in Syria today. In some respects, it might be easier to talk about the longer-term challenges that we face because there's concern in capitals today about facing the short-term crisis of Syria and what Western policy should be in the conflict in Syria today. As you know, there are diversity of views within the European Union. There are diversity of views within Washington. And we've seen a creeping evolution of Western policy as the situation in Syria has continued to deteriorate. So I'd welcome your views and what is the right role that you would like to see the European Union, European member states, and the United States play in the crisis in Syria today.
You want me to address all of those?
So, yes, both strands, the macro and then bring it back to Syria.
In 5 minutes? Well, thank you for having me. I do find myself in the debate between the ambassador and Tarek, closer to Tarek's actually point of view. I would offer the following 2 points. First of all, I think the change that took place in the Arab world is positive. And I think in order to understand that, we need to reconsider our paradigm regarding the Middle East. In the past, both the United States and Europe emphasized stability in the Arab world at the expense of democracy. And I think as such, that you have this skepticism among the youth of the Arab world toward both the United States and Europe. And I think that all of the regime changes that took place from Tunisia to Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and what's happening in Syria is very, very important step in a long process that's going to be a difficult one. I don't underestimate the challenges that's facing all of these countries. But in the process of transition, I think removing those types of regime was the first necessary step toward that political reform that was way overdue. So, people who ruled these countries for over, 30 years, you cannot expect certain change with these kind of mentalities. In some cases like Syria, Assad actually was able to pass on power to his son in violations of the Republican principles. And the West consented to that. We were talking before this panel with the ambassador, how many countries actually, leading countries like France and the US, blessed that process because they were looking through the prism of stability, through the prism whether Bashar al-Assad can make peace with Israel or not. And I think we need to reconsider those kind of issues. The Eurocentric, American-centric perspective of the Arab world must change. So I think a more perspective is needed to look at it from the point of view of the people of the Arab world. That's my first point. So I think if you start to reconsider that paradigm, I think you are able to see a lot of the positive things happening. I do disagree with the ambassador's assessment that what's happening in Tunisia and Egypt today is equally intolerant or repressive, yes, there are a lot of, in fact, practices that should be, examined. A lot of these countries should be criticized for, not respecting certain rights, maybe not standing up to a lot of the commitment they made. But I think what's important, as Tarek said, is that we stay supportive of the process, insist that we are going to have a next election, insist that we hold them to the same standards of international human rights and so on and so forth. I think that's what's important. So that's my general introduction. Now, regarding Syria, I think what's needed, and I'll leave it there, I believe we should accept that the transition had begun in Syria. I think it is important as a starting point to look at Syria as a continuation of the Arab Spring countries, that people of Syria want change, and they will not accept any role for this regime, especially those who committed crimes against humanity, against the Syrian people. I think we have still some problems in the thinking of policymakers. They still consider Bashar al-Assad as a responsible leader after all what he's done. And I think this is a serious problem among some countries. I do believe that there is a good positive development, which is there's a group called the Friends of Syria that includes most of the cross-Atlantic countries, North America and European Union countries. And they are committed to change in Syria. I think the expectations are higher than what they offered so far. So it's not, we don't want to reduce what's happening to Syria into a humanitarian issue, despite the fact that it's important to provide assistance to almost 5 million refugees, but to stay focused on the fact that if you want to help Syria, help topple this regime as quickly, as effectively as possible. That's the best way to help the process of change in Syria, and I'll stop here.
Thank you, Najib. I'm going to come back to that because I want to parse that a little bit more in terms of what that really means. But Ambassador, I want to come back to you now. And you've heard from your two other colleagues here. Can you talk a little bit about EU policy now? And as I understand, the EU's recently adopted a set of principles for policy towards the region: stability, security, prosperity, where there is an absence of this, democracy is one of those key pillars. So how do you see EU interest in the region right now in the context of all of the transitions that are taking place? And where would you like to see EU policy go in playing the right supporting role?
I think the first element, and I think there we all agree, is that there are free elections now in the vast majority of countries. This is new for most of them, and this is good. So we're not going to complain about that. The second element is that I consider, and I'm not in the policy making domain anymore, that there is a huge political deficit for the EU or for the US as well, because of, as I said before, we indeed sided with Assad, Mubarak, Ben Ali, and even Gaddafi, and I was paid for years to do that. We probably have a watershed with September 11, because all these regimes, all these people I just mentioned, portrayed themselves as the best firewall against terrorism. And you need to look at the Jabba bombing in April 2002. You need to look at interrogation of various suspects in various countries. We all cooperated very, very deeply with these regimes. Therefore, we have a legitimacy deficit today with those in power. The EU has revised its policy very quickly Remember that the Arab Spring started in December 2011, January 2012. Already in March 2012, there was a new policy document adopted, which gives more emphasis to governance issues than economic issues, or than the previous balance between the two that we had. This is good. And also more resources have been devoted. Problem is that we were used to a set of interlocutors in governments, in administration, in civil society, and the center of gravity of all this has shifted. At the center of the politics of Egypt and Tunisia are the Brotherhood or Ennahda. Okay. And to their extreme, you have the Salafists, with whom we have no relations, not much knowledge, and then you have the liberal actors, political actors, and civil society actors. These actors, we know them extremely well. We keep talking to them, except that they've taken a beating in recent elections. They don't represent much. They are nice people. We understand their analysis. And I don't want to give names here, but I meet some of them, and they're as brilliant as ever. We understand what they say, but people don't vote for them in their own country. So the debate is not primarily with us. It's within the countries. And if you look at the weekly events in Cairo, what you see is that a lot of people who voted for the Brotherhood are now opposing the Brotherhood, or at least shouting in the streets against them, because economic reforms are not coming. In Egypt today, you have half the tourism you had before, if not less. National capital has fled. No more foreign domestic direct investment is coming. So you have huge worries. And of course, the agreement with the IMF, which is indispensable, is very long in coming. So only that part, which I'm sure Tarek would be able to comment much better than me, is a worry for the Egyptian people as much as it is for the Western community. And I'm not talking here of the complete catastrophe, which, for example, troubles on the Suez Canal will represent not at Egypt level or Egypt-EU level, but world level, because you're talking of a substantial chunk of world trade, oil trade, and military movements through the canal that would be disrupted. So this is more serious than even during the 1967 war or other events. So that is one of the difficulties. But in short, the EU has no other choice than keep engaging with the new political actors and with the new civil society actors.
So, Mr. Ambassador, let me bring that to Syria. What does that mean in the case of Syria, where at the end of May, the arms embargo that the European Union imposed against all actors in Syria expires? And there's some EU member states that are advocating potentially beginning to provide lethal weapons to the Syrian opposition. What do you think will happen with the European approach in Syria, and what do you think should happen?
Before that, before I answer that question, look at the two key ingredients in Syria. Number one, this is an asymmetrical conflict where at least Russia and Iran are supplying on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, the regime with weapons. Every stock is replenished by supplies. You have Iranian fighters on the ground, or at least counselors, and we do not supply counselors or weapons. So, and this has very little to do with the Syrian conflict. It's a posture of Russia wanting to put in place a new international order, take a revenge on what happened in Libya, where they considered that the UN Security Council resolution was abused by the West, etc. All that is perfectly documented. But that means that the Assad regime can bombard people with airplanes and Scud missiles, people waiting in line for bread. That's what's happening. Second thing is that on the ground, the best financed militias are the most radical ones, especially al-Nusra. So the dilemma that the US and the EU are facing is who to... It's not an issue of winning a war. It's an issue of rebalancing the conflict, basically, and trying to stop this massacre by the Syrian regime. The problem is, and the very difficult part of the discussion right now, is who do you supply with anti-tank missiles and anti-aircraft missiles, and how do you train these people, and how do you monitor the use of these weapons that you would deliver. And that takes inevitably personnel. It takes 200, 300, 400 people on the ground. Otherwise, you would have no control whatsoever. Even if we don't do anything, the stockpiles of the Syrian army can be spread quite easily, and that includes, of course, anti-tank missiles and anti-aircraft missiles. So there we have a massive issue in our hands, and it's very hard for us to understand fully the Russian position, because everybody knows, we have all written about this for about a year now. Myself, I published ever since I joined Carnegie 6 months ago about this, that every day that passes gives more legitimacy to radical Islamist movement in Syria, and therefore this is the main worry.
So what do you expect to happen at the end of May with European
Some sort of
policy?
decision to move forward, always carefully, as the EU does, but there will be some sort of movement, yes.
Okay. So Tarek and Najib, let me bring this back to you. What the ambassador is hitting at is the complexity, the difficulty for Europeans, Americans, North Americans to figure out how to engage and who to work with, and whether it's in Egypt. Right now, Tarek, what we're hearing even from some of our scholars in our Hariri Center is that the United States is falling back into a instinctive, perhaps, stability mode, and perhaps doing too much directly with the regime, the Muslim Brotherhood, to the detriment of other voices in society. And in Syria, where Western policy has been paralyzed because of concern of forces, as you well know, in the Syrian opposition, that are antithetical to the interests and the values of Europe and the United States, al-Nusra, as the ambassador mentioned. So how do we navigate this? How is it playing out in countries in transition like Egypt, Tarek? How does the West figure out how to relate to actors and communities that it hasn't had traditional long-term relationships with, and not fall back into patterns of reinforcing certain factions over others through its policies?
Okay, let me slightly disagree on one perception, perhaps. Because of the novelty of Arab political Islamism as, if you'd like, a legitimate player. Remember, these groups, whether Nahda in Tunis or the Brotherhood in Egypt, or even the PJD in Morocco until recently, were illegal groups. So if you are an ambassador, for example, there, even your contacts with them would have to have been, to some extent, qualified. And of course, their presence in local media, let alone international media, was very limited. So the fact that you have countries that have been very secular, relatively in the system at least, for the past half century, in the span of 18 months, having people who were in prison coming to become prime ministers in months and days, of course, that is raising lots of eyebrows internally, not just in Europe. But the point I'm trying to say is that they are actually not as dominant socially or politically in these countries as they are portrayed internationally. I think 2 points make or give the impression that they are probably much more powerful than they actually are. One is the division of the others, and that is applicable, I would say, across the board in the Arab world. That whereas groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood or Nahda or the Islamic Action Front, or even if you extend slightly to Kuwait, which is very interesting as the only real viable democratic process in action, at least in the Gulf, the Islamists are very organized. There are structures. There are actual command and control within these groups. That is not applicable in any liberal group in any of these other countries. The second point is that there has also been a change in the nature of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, as well as in Nahda in Tunisia. When those who have talked to the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, in 2000, let's say, I would say 90% that your counterpart, your interlocutor, would have been an ideologue, would have been somebody who have been imprisoned in President Sadat's time or Mubarak's time, have studied Islamic jurisprudence, and who would talk to you, whether an Egyptian journalist or an American ambassador or a Western civil society player, trying to convince you of why Islam is not a threat, and more or less taking a very strategic approach. That has changed in the past 10 years. The key leaders today, for example, in the Islamic groups across the board, are people who have studied to a large extent in the West. Many of them come with economics or engineering background. Many of them have worked in multinationals internationally. Long story short, unlike the liberals, actually, they are the ones right now who are presenting political economy solutions. If you look at Egypt, for example, the #1 issue right now in front of the current Egyptian government or the next one, again, will be the subsidies issue. And that has massive implications regarding policy in sectors such as oil, such as importing, food, distributions of, and. The Muslim Brotherhood is putting forward ideas that are interesting. You can agree with them or disagree with them, but actually they are offering solutions. Others are not. And that's a very interesting point. So not only actually the change in leadership resulted in a change in rhetoric, but actually it resulted in a change in modus operandi, if you like. They're not focusing just on the legalese of the transition, but on what people can relate to, and that is interesting. But, and I don't want to speak too much, why I'm saying they are not dominant, these two elements make them conspicuous, make them set the agenda, if you'd like. But if you look at the elections, whether in Egypt or in Tunisia, the turnout rates, or in Morocco, by the way, the turnout rates were actually very low, relatively. We're talking about 30% here, 40% there. And these groups have more or less blocks that they can rely upon. They will always vote for them for many historical reasons. But the moment you have wider engagement in politics in these countries, turnout rates becomes much higher. That ceiling becomes much lower percentage of the entire pie. And that's why Ennahda, for example, in Tunisia, is ruling based on a 33% vote in, or block in the parliament. That, I don't think, personally, others might disagree with me, will not increase much. Actually, I think it will go down. What will make Ennahda the determinant player or not in the next Tunisian government is the turnout. If the turnout is much higher, then I think we will see fragmentation. And my view is that, I might be wrong, of course, but my thinking is that across the board, we will not see the next 5 years dominant Islamist players in governments. We will see them as very important players in more fragmented political environments. And here I come back to the institutions point. In fragmented political milieus, you're not betting on one player. There's no Nasser to lead everything. There's no Ben Ali to say it will happen and that's it. And it will not be the guidance bureau of the Muslim Brotherhood who will set the agenda. It will be the institutions. If the parliament is functioning decently with 7, 8 key players there, then the process will be moving ahead. And you can apply that in wider perspective, I think. So I come back, I hope I'm not repeating myself, but I come back to the importance of institutions as opposed to what 5 people today in Ennahda or 10 people in the Muslim Brotherhood think. I think they will not prove to be as dominant as we think.
The importance of dialogue.
Yeah. Najib, apply this in the case of Syria, where Western policy has almost been immobilized because of concern of the various actors in the Syrian opposition, of figuring out how Western policy is not complicit in actually strengthening the hand of those that may come back to bite European and U.S. interest in the wake of the fall of the Assad regime?
I think, again, I go back to the point of the lack of understanding of the complexity of Islamism in the Arab world and in Syria in particular. I find, again, myself more in agreement with Tarek on those issues. That is, this is a very complex issue. The Islamists in the Arab world and in Syria in particular are part of the political scene. They are, activists. In the case of Syria, I don't expect to see big showing in post-Assad election, let's say for the Muslim Brotherhood, for a lot of reasons. One of them, they've been repressed in Syria. In fact, their status still today under Assad is there is, membership in the Brotherhood is a capital punishment. I mean, it's so they've been outside. We don't know the level of popularity they have, but there is some sympathy with them. The rise of the extremists, the Salafis in Syria, I think happened relatively recently in Syria. And I do want to emphasize the fact that part of that movement, and this is very ironic, in fact, is connected to the regime itself. The regime recruited some of those young radicals during the American invasion of Iraq and was sending them to kill Americans in Iraq. I mean, I do emphasize that point. And of course, it was very kind of extreme, pragmatic perspective on the side of the regime. Get rid of these people and cause trouble for the Americans in Iraq. I mean, make that project fail. Democracy in Iraq, as anywhere else, is against, this regime. So some of them came back. Some of them were actually in prison, and they were released during the course of the revolution. I remember the discourse of the regime from day one, when this revolution was peaceful, that the regime was fighting armed gang, was fighting extremists, was fighting Al-Qaeda. So it's made it into kind of reality in a way. Anyway, what I want to say is that I think we should not exaggerate the power of this group. They do exist today. I think they gained some momentum in the absence of international support to the moderate forces and in their ability to provide and fill a vacuum in terms of providing services. But it's never too late. I think their numbers is very small. That's what I know. And if you provide the moderate forces with the kind of support they need, I think you could easily undermine that force. So I'm not very skeptical. I'm not very concerned about the future of that. But I'm concerned about that the more we let this go on, this conflict, you have the prospect not only of the rise of extremism, but of chaos, of actually Syria moving into a failed state. And then that's danger with the rise of extremism becomes serious danger for regional stability, not just for Syria itself. So I think it's still plenty of time now to support the moderate forces in Syria, both the military and the political, and I think help Syria go through this transformation.
I think we indeed see an emerging shift in policy, potentially in Europe and the United States right now. We've got a lot of expertise on the stage, so I want to, and in the audience. So I want to turn to you. Let's start with the gentleman in the second row, and then we'll go to the back row back there.
Thank you very much. Shlomo Avineri, Hebrew University, Jerusalem. I want to raise 2 points and would like to have the comments of the members of the panel. One has to do with society, another is the state system. Tarek mentioned the importance of institutions. I think this is very, very important because we tend to focus on personalities. Institution building is extremely important, especially when we deal with societies where civil society institutions are on one hand very weak historically, and on the other hand, as in the case of Egypt, the strongest civil society network is the Muslim Brotherhood for historical reasons. Now, how do you create or transcend that kind of legacy? The second issue, and perhaps this is much more neglected in the West, is the state system. The state system in the Middle East, especially, in the Levant, in the Mashraq, has been something which has been around for almost 100 years, and it was imposed by Western imperialism. Countries like Iraq or Syria and Lebanon, not Egypt, which has a long history, have been set up by British and French imperialists, Sykes-Picot. Isn't it the case that what we're seeing today is not only regimes change and transformations, but also transformation of the state system? As we have seen in Central and Eastern Europe, what happened in the Soviet Union was a dissolution of the Soviet Union. What happened in Yugoslavia, even in Czechoslovakia. We're seeing something like this in Iraq, which is not the unitary state it used to be. We're seeing something like this in Sudan. The problems of Libya have to do with the difficulties of creating a coherent polity in a region which has never been a country coherently before the Italian occupation, etc. Now, isn't it the case that one has to think seriously in Washington, in Brussels, everywhere else, to relate to the issues that what we're going to see is a dissolution or transformation of the state system, that some of the countries that we know will not exist the way they did, and some may not exist anymore at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Okay, let's go back to the fifth row, if we can, to the two gentlemen in the back. And then I'm going to ask everyone, just please introduce yourself, and please be brief. There are a lot of hands in the audience, and I want to work you into the conversation. I'm going to collect a few for you on the panel and then come back to you.
Thank you, Damon. I'm Roland Freudenstein from the Center for European Studies in Brussels, and I would like to go back to the cases of Egypt and Tunisia and ask, Tarek mainly, you know, we all witnessed this polarization between political Islam and all the rest. As much as all the rest was diversified, but the main question seemed to be along the lines of the relation between religion and politics, or the role that religion should play in society. Now, you've got, in both countries, Tunisia and Egypt, new parties like Al-Wasat in Egypt. In Tunisia, you have Nida Tunis. Now, I'm not comparing these two, except in one point, that they seem to transcend the classical divides here, or the divides that have developed over the last couple of years. Al-Wasat in Egypt seems to try to aim for a middle ground between political Islam and the secular liberals. Nida Tunis in Tunisia is labeled by some as a renaissance of the old regime, but others see it as the first efficient, effective secular force in Tunisian politics. So I was just wondering whether, what about these new parties, new movements coming up?
Thanks, Roland. And then just this gentleman here on the corner. Sorry, we'll come back to you, sir.
Ola Tunander from the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. Kofi Annan said last autumn that it was an agreement between the Permanent Five in Geneva, the 30th of June actually, about Syria and about creating a transition government, about to keeping the security forces to avoid chaos, and also the next meeting in New York would only go into the details of this agreement. But suddenly, on this next meeting, certain countries have changed their mind and raised Chapter 7. And then he said that he was surprised about that because they knew that Russia and China would never accept it because they had been very clear on that in Geneva. So the point was rather that they raised this Chapter 7 to avoid the solution. And I guess that they believed at the time that the opposition would be clearly winning in a few months' time. But that was not what happened. So how do you explain this change of position from this three countries, from France, Britain, US actually? Okay, thank you.
A fairly provocative question. Let's bring that back to the panel, and then I'll pick up the other questions we have. So why don't we start with you, Tarek, and we'll work our way down to the ambassador, please.
Sure, I'll try to
Don't feel the need to answer every element, but pick the points that were most relevant to you.
I'll try to be brief. On Mr. Avenieri's point, I agree. The Muslim Brotherhood's network, and by that I mean effectively the services network it has built over the past, people say 20, 30 years, I would argue at least half a century, if not more, is by far the most widespread, has the highest reach, the richest, and the most organized in the country, by far. But interestingly, when you speak to the Muslim Brotherhood right now, this is creating a major challenge for them. Because right now, the Muslim Brotherhood, I would venture and say, is in a real dilemma. And that's applicable to the Muslim Brotherhood, not to any other Arab Islamist group, because of their success over the past half century. Their dilemma is how to turn that into the state system that has been very hostile to them in the same period. And I know of a number of cases whereby now there are new ministers, there are very prominent players in certain governmental institutions who are products of this civil society infrastructure. And there have been very clear attempts in many cases in Egypt to take parts of that services infrastructure of the Brotherhood and try to integrate it within the Egyptian state system to the detriment of the Brotherhood and to massive resistance from the pillars of the state system. Whether they will succeed in this or not, I think it's a big question mark. I think the Brotherhood's leadership now and the second leadership is also divided upon that. But let me raise another point. I think it's interesting in the same theme you raised, is that one of the things that, at least based on my coverage, I don't see very much represented in international media or even in Arab media, is a very, in my view, deliberate attempt by the new leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood, which to a very large extent come from the business sector, not really from politics, to turn parts of that civil society / services infrastructure into very powerful market shares in key economic sectors in the country. And the bet is very clear. If we move from the shadow economy or the gray economy towards the actual economy of the country with clear market shares, this will entrench our socio-political presence and therefore will entrench our power. And there is massive response to that or resistance to that, not just from liberal groups or secular groups, but actually from economic interests that have dominated these sectors for a long time. So here, it's also a clash not just of ideas, a clash of money in these sectors. But I think, to me, this is the real battle going on right now in Egypt. It's far from the politics, but I think it has the highest potential impact on politics. On the second point, to be very quick, on the state system, but I totally agree with that. I think, long story short, we've seen the liberal experiment in the Arab world in the first half of the 20th century fail for different reasons. We've seen Arab nationalism fail. We've seen the past 40, 45 years obviously failing in the Arab world. And I go back to the demographic element. This 180 million Arabs under 30 years old or 25 years old who do not connect to any of that, they will form their own narratives. And of course, part of these narratives could be sectarian. And if it develops into a sectarian narrative, then I think I would agree with you. Probably will see severe fragmentation, maybe more on the Eastern Mediterranean than in North Africa. But I think, yes, some countries, I would agree, probably would cease to exist, and some probably will exist in forms, as you said yesterday in your talk, reminiscent of Lebanon in the 80s, for example. So I think the nature of the narrative of the new generation, I think, is extremely important. And the problem right now that we are not seeing any leaders, really, we're not seeing any coherence of these young groups. But that's, as you know much more than I do, a very rich story, so there's probably no time for that. But this is the variable for me.
Thank you, Tarek. Najib, let me ask you to pick up particularly the Syria issue that came up.
The question about...
The Chapter 7 change in positions among Western countries.
The question was targeted to the ambassador more so than to us in the opposition. Or I think that actually it's the problem with Geneva is Russia's interpretation of Geneva. That's how I see it. They have an interpretation nobody shares with them, and that is when you talk about transitional government acceptable to both sides. To us, Assad is not acceptable. And they continue to insist that Assad should be part of the process, should be part of the solution. I think that's the problem I see it. The issue of trying to bring the topic into the Security Council, I think it made sense at the time. Because there have been several initiatives, the Arab League first, the Arab observers, then Kofi Annan, the peace or the international observers. But the weakness of all of those attempts, there were no consequences for not abiding, for not implementing those commitments. And I think it would make sense to go back to the Security Council and try to have Chapter 7 to back even those agreements that the Russians signed into. But when it was brought up to the discussion, the Russian used veto for the third time. So I don't think it was a problem for the opposition or their friends.
Thank you. Ambassador, do you want to respond to some of these points?
Yes, I think on the institutions and civil society, we have 2 points here. It's extremely important, as Tarek mentioned, that the institutional process goes on. New constitution, new electoral law, new political parties law, new judiciary reform, and so on and so forth. This is painful. It's going to take years, but it's going to happen because it's irreversible. But in diverse societies, such as Egypt, for example, let alone when the day comes, Syria, what you need is also a dialogue between the various components of the society, even though they may not be represented by a majority of deputies in parliament. That is the essential part, and this is the current difficulty. We were talking earlier about how split the opposition forces were compared to Ennahda or Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, I just want to remind the audience, in the Constituent Assembly elections in Tunisia, in front of Ennahda, you had 100 lists in some districts. How do you want people who have been used to 40 years of fake elections to make a genuine choice between 100 lists? It's impossible. So Nida Tunis, for example, is one of these efforts to regroup these forces. Not exactly easy, because inevitably you have elements from the old regime, and that would appear. So that storm is going on. It's going to take quite a while. At the same time, we need to engage the civil society in the process. Although, of course, those in power today prefer the ballot box than civil society dialogue. On the question about states, it's an obvious danger, if not a probability, that Syria will be partitioned. There may be a mini Alawite state. There may be a Kurdish entity somewhere. In Iraq, we all see that the Kurdistan regional government today is thriving on its oil resources. Strangely enough, this is the best success of Turkish foreign policy, with some, of course, problems with Baghdad. But these lines are being redefined. We don't know where it's going to end up, but it is there. And that is valid primarily for Syria and Iraq, I think, not for the others.
Terrific, thank you. Let me, if I could get a mic up here on the front row for these two gentlemen, first in the front and then on the side.
Thank you. My name is Diego López Garrido. I come from Spain, Spanish Parliament. And I'm Vice President of the special group at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly dedicated to the Mediterranean and Middle East. My question is addressed to the Syrian opposition representative in relation with the heat question of delivering weapons to the opposition troops. In the European Union, we are divided. United Kingdom and France are in favor of delivering weapons to the opposition troops, and the rest are against. And so far, the United States against as well, because of two reasons. First, the opposition is a little bit fragmented, and second, if you deliver weapons to one side of the conflict, you rule out the unnegotiated way out of the conflict. I'd like to know your opinion about that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And please, over here.
Charles Tannock, a member of the European Parliament. Some prominent figures in my own party, the British Conservatives, believe that some of the Islamist parties, particularly the Moroccan Justice and Development, the AK Party in Turkey, are just sort of the equivalent to German Christian democracy. And they are going as far now as extending our family, political family, the grouping that we belong to these parties. Are we being naive? Because I had a conversation with a very senior UAE official who said that we're being duped. Would you like to comment on that? Is it the equivalent of Christian democracy? And should we be, as it were, developing formal links from centre-right parties with Islamist Islamist parties in the Arab Spring countries? And can we trust them to relinquish power at the next election? Because I think my fear, of course, with a lot of these parties, it's one person, one vote, and never again. And will they actually step down at the next election? And the other question is to do with conditionality, particularly with Egypt, where there's a massive mobilization of EU aid, trade, EBRD, EIB finance, and so on, should there be more conditionality to President Morsi in terms of respecting fundamental rights, particularly the Copts, the Christians, women's rights, and the non-application of the more extreme versions of Sharia, the Hudud ordinances? And lastly, going back to the issue of Syria, Jabr al-Nusra, it does concern me some of the so-called moderate Gulf states like Qatar are clearly arming the Salafists. Should we be putting more pressure on them to stop that? Because they did that in Libya with disastrous consequences in Mali, where we now have to intervene, France and others and the EU. Clearly, we don't want to see a repetition of that. Also how, if the UK, my country, and France are successful in, as it were, allowing the EU arms embargo to be discontinued and start arming the rebels, particularly the FSA under Salim Idris, how can we stop the flow of these arms to the Salafists? How can we interdict that flow?
Good set of questions. Let me go back to the gentleman in the back, please.
Thank you. Ayman Mhanna from the Samir Kassir Foundation in Beirut, Lebanon. One of the success of the political transitions in the MENA region is largely dependent on the success in this challenge, which is managing diversity. All the countries in the region have either sectarian or ethnic or definitely political diversity, which require institutional translations, institutional developments in order to cater for all these different groups' needs, whether through consociational regimes, decentralization, potentially fragmentation, but these are institutional setups that are hard to implement, that require expertise, support, consultations, and other experiences. After years of conflict and problems, will the EU, the question goes to the ambassador, will the EU, the United States, the large donors, will they be ready to engage the kind of funding and the kind of investment needed for the German Stiftungs, for NDI, IRI, all the big institutions that do political support, in order to accompany the new institutional development that is needed on the ground, or with the economic problems they face and the fatigue vis-à-vis developments in the region, we will reach a situation where, okay, transitions have taken place, but there is no money and no support for the follow-up that is highly needed. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And this gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Andrew Retman. I'm a journalist with EU Observer. It's a news agency in Brussels. I have a general question for the panel. We mentioned the potential sort of redrawing of the map in the region, especially in perhaps Syria and Iraq. But what relevance does these changes have for the future of Israel, its shape, and the Arab-Israeli conflict in general? And then a specific question perhaps for Ambassador PIERINI. If Hezbollah in Lebanon is a sort of particular equivalent of the Muslim Brotherhood in terms of providing services, also having a broad social role as well as a political one, would it be wise for the EU to put it on its terrorist register?
Great, terrific. And let me pick up this gentleman here on this flank as well. And we've got a full set of questions I'll bring back to the panel after this.
Yes, I am İlter Turan from Istanbul Bilgi University. This is a question to Professor GHADBIAN. It is sometimes suggested, accurately or inaccurately, that there is a major disconnect between the Syrian opposition as represented abroad and Syrian opposition as exists in Syria itself. And this constitutes one of the major problems of the world relating to Syria, because they relate to the external opposition, but that doesn't translate into action regarding the internal opposition. Is there any truth to that, or what?
Terrific, thank you. All right, we've got a cluster of questions here. I'm going to start with the ambassador. A couple on arms to Syria, the one we just had on Syria, the political party affiliation, conditionality for international aid, stopping Gulf countries from providing support to more dangerous elements in Syria, the investment financing issues of managing diversity, implications for Israel, Hezbollah. That's a lot. So pick out a couple of the foreign policy ones.
We have a conference in front of us here.
Yes.
Well, I'll start with EU funding. EU funding is here. It's available. It's not being drastically reduced. The problem is essentially for EU institutions, namely the External Service and the Commission, to get a better grasp on who is at work. We've been used to deal with a set of institutions. Now we have new civil society actors. It is absolutely crucial that we engage with the youth, we engage with civil society organizations that we were not dealing with before, and above all, that we convince the political echelons in these countries to give a structural place to dialogue with the civil society. That is essential. Carnegie Europe plays its little role here. On the 7th and 8th of May, we have a conference on these subjects in Brussels. We're bringing new political actors from the countries in the region, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, and so on. On how to consider Ennahda or PJD compared to the Christian Democrats in Europe. This is a huge debate. Of course, we can easily see that in their position today, meaning in power in Morocco, strong minority in Tunisia, the same, they would want to get political recognition by having institutional structured links with the EPP or the Christian Democrats in general across Europe. Of course, if you roughly compare the political spectrums of European countries and Arab countries, there is a certain similarity. Problem is, are the set of values that these parties are defending acceptable to the Christian democratic parties in Europe? And I'm not sure at this point. I'm not saying that this is set in concrete. Of course, the exercise of power brings in itself changes to doctrine, but for the moment, I don't see that we are on the same page, or that at least that Christian Democrats in Europe and the Brotherhood in Egypt or Ennahda in Tunisia or even the PJD are fully on the same page. So there also what's recommended is a lot more discussion before we get to any decision. Then on Hezbollah, of course it is a standard Israeli position to request from the EU to put Hezbollah on the list of terrorist organizations. The only problem with that is that Hezbollah is in government in Lebanon out of elections. So it's not a case limited to Lebanon. We've had the same with Hamas in Gaza. The elections in Gaza were clean, but my colleagues my former colleagues there were still prohibited to talk to Hamas. So we have to square this issue and decide who to engage. I'll stop at that for the moment and leave some for my colleagues.
NAJIB, please.
3 questions were addressed to me very briefly. The question of the opposition and the fact that it's divided. Yes, I mean, the opposition is divided. And under authoritarian, extreme authoritarian rule, that's the norm. You don't have strong, unified opposition. I mean, opposition thrives under democratic polities. I mean, that's the logic of things. I just would give you one example. Back in 2003, there was a group of young people who decided to be active in somehow. They want to do something. And you know, politics is not a field that's allowed for young people in Syria under the regime. So this is a town very well-known town near Damascus called Daraya. So they came up with an idea. They said, let's get together and clean the street. It's not political. They were arrested, all 70 of them. The idea was, are you trying to take over the work of the state? Are you telling us the state is not doing its job? I mean, this is an example of, you know, the background in which, you know, opposition had to function. This is why those who were living outside played a role in leading the opposition after the beginning of the revolution. But to answer the question, actually lately, and since the crackdown on the revolution, many of the activists who were not arrested had to leave the country. So they are, in fact, now very active. But the latest formation, the Syrian coalition, one of its most, I think, important strength is the fact it does represent local councils in the 14 provinces of Syria. those that the councils were trying to provide alternative and fill in the vacuum, provide services and governance. That's the first element. The second element, the Syrian coalition is trying to help unify the Free Syrian Army under the Supreme Military Council headed by General Idris. And this is the group we feel that's the most viable and moderate and should be supported. And that's bringing me to the question of the gentleman from Britain. Yes, I think we should support this formation. And if you can help us with our allies and friends not to support al-Nusra. We don't want anyone to support al-Nusra, whether states or individuals. In fact, this is a serious threat to the future of Syria. It's not just to the friends of Syria. So if you can do anything in that area, I think that would be welcome by Britain, France, and I think that's what we're asking for. Last point about arming the opposition. Doesn't that lead to further, prolonging the conflict? I think it's to the contrary. As the ambassador said, the regime is getting all the weapons it needs to continue its killing, its crackdown, its destruction of Syria from primarily Iran and to some extent Russia. So the arms embargo is really punishing the Free Syrian Army in some way. I think we need to continue to support a political settlement, but political settlement must be enforced in the case of Syria. And knowing the mentality of Bashar al-Assad, I doubt very much he believes in a political settlement. I think the significance of continuing to push for political settlement is for those who are supporting him. Maybe if they were, they should feel that there's always an opportunity for them to shift side. There is a future for those who are siding with the regime in the post-Assad. I think if we make that point, while we continue to allow the Free Syrian Army to have the right for self-defense, legitimate self-defense, and the defense of civilians, which, by the way, the international community failed to provide. I think you could make a strong case for the case in Syria that it's ideal for the responsibility to protect under the UN mandate in 2005. The UN failed to do so because the Security Council is divided. The General Assembly is not doing much. So the other alternative is to allow the Free Syrian Army to carry out that responsibility. And I think the argument I would make, the providing strategic weaponry to the Free Syrian Army is going to end this conflict quickly. While again, we should continue to make the prospect for a solution open the whole time, and it can be done. I mean, despite all of the limitations on arming the Free Syrian Army, they're making advances on a daily basis. So there's no contradiction between the two. The way to end this quickly is to support the Free Syrian Army with weapons from the friends and allies.
Thank you, Najib. Let's turn to you, Tarek, for the final wrap-up.
Sure. I'll touch on the question about should the international community fear the Arab Islamists. And there was also a question from Roland about new players, whether it's Al-Wasat in Egypt or Nidat Tunis in Tunisia. And for me, really, the interesting point here is that apart from the politics and apart from the economic side, back to the social element, there is an identity politics going on in the Arab world right now. And it is on the external, in the foreign affairs, international relations scene, I think it's established. I mean, many would argue that the involvement of Hezbollah in Syria, despite many elements, has a sectarian element to it. Many would argue that that the involvement of Qatar has actually some sort of a sectarian element in it. Some would even go and say the Turkish position has some sort of sectarian element to it. So on the international relations scene, I think it's established, in my mind at least, that the sectarian dimension is, if not then one of the most important dimensions. But the question is within the countries themselves. Is the Muslim Brotherhood or Al-Nahda or the new player Al-Wasat, are they playing identity politics? Vote for me because I am a better Muslim than the other. Or vote for me because I want to implement Islamic Sharia and our identity is Islamic, full stop. And I think, and I alluded to that before, there is now a division, not within Arab political Islamism in general, but within each of these groups into more or less two divisions. One that's the older generation that has always played a mix of identity politics, and patronage politics, the services infrastructure. You invest basically in distributing butter, oil, oil as in cooking oil and things like that before elections, and you win certain votes, and you mix the two, patronage and identity, and therefore, voila, I am the major player in the parliament. But there is a new element within political Islam, I think much more interesting, led by a new generation that is trying to address politics and present themselves in their own countries as those who are solution providers to real problems, subsidies, development of certain sectors, youth unemployment, development of small and medium-sized enterprises. And because those guys come from the private sector, because most of them have been educated in the West and are businessmen in their own, and women, by the way, in some cases, in their own capacities within political Islam, they are not attuned very much to the identity politics. They are attuned to patronage politics, to distribute money, get the votes. But the future of the Muslim Brotherhood or Nahda or others, I think, will lie in this. The more they go to the new approach of we are solution providers, we are politicians, basically, the better, obviously, for the society. And I think the more they will force the others as well to play politics. And I think that would be fantastic. We'll end up having valuable solutions to, or potential solutions to, political economy problems, which is normal politics as anywhere in the world. And people will vote for those who they think will provide the best solution. Or the old scenario, the old school of thinking will dominate, identity politics full stop. And I think what we will see as the sectarianism in the international relations becoming also sectarianism within the countries. And if that materializes, then in my view, the future of the Middle East is very bleak. So I think it's that dimension within the Islamists themselves that will be a major variable.
Thank you very much, Tarek. I'm going to do something novel and try to actually bring our session to a close on time. I want to wrap up by saying I think it's very appropriate that we're concluding with this conversation today. The immensity of the scope of the changes that are taking place in a region which is your region, it's Europe's footsteps, doorstep, it's enormous. And I think the challenge that we've seen from our conversation today is it's complex. We've struggled with how to get this right, and we've made mistakes. But now I think our societies, our governments, our people have an opportunity to figure out how to play the right role as these societies go through fairly dramatic transformations. I know there were more questions in the audience. I didn't have a chance to get to everyone. I think that's terrific. It shows the demand, the interest in this issue in particular. I think it also indicates the significance of the topic as well as the quality of a conference, that in the last session in the afternoon on a Saturday, all of you are here and that we're at capacity in this room. And I suspect that's in part because everyone in this room has played some type of role in transition. Everyone in this room has played some type of role in supporting a transition from authoritarianism to pluralism. Most of you know, many of you know, this conference was born out of that concept. It was born out of an initial effort to help create civil society, help to create and foster a debate here in Slovakia. And I think it's a real testament to the organizers, to all of you, that it's succeeding tremendously. It's important, I think, as we go forward, that the way we think about including this community of North Africa and the Middle East in our Atlantic community is an important element of our ongoing conversations. So please join me in thanking Ambassador MARC PIERINI, NAJIB GHADBIAN, and TAREK OSMAN for a terrific, terrific conversation.
Thank you, Damon. And if I can have your attention for a few minutes, I'm not going to be too long. I should summarize the Globsec conference for a few minutes. I'm not going to be long, but I'll tell you only a few numbers because we made several records this year. We had the biggest number of participants this year. We had 1,140 registered participants at Globsec this year. That's the highest number ever in 8 years' history of Globsec, something that we don't want to surpass next year. Definitely. This conference room is small. Second, we had the largest number of dinner sessions, all kind of policy sessions. And I don't know if you feel the same as me, but I'm quite tired because the discussions are not going only here in the main conference room, but also I've seen many of you having very lively discussions until late night. So you're starting early, but also discussing until the late night. Another record what we achieved is that we had the biggest number of countries represented at Globsec, and it's 62. That's a quite substantial number. We had 133 speakers, also very nice number. We had hundreds of tweets, social media statuses, the highest number of international media, 132 journalists from more than 30 countries. We had the biggest media coverage so far in 8 years' history, and I'm looking forward for the media outcomes that you will find on our website. But Globsec was not only about this. We had around 150 bilateral and multilateral meetings, several policy sessions, transatlantic agenda for the 21st century, energy forum, Moldova and Georgia reality checks, cybersecurity, high-level reflection group for Central Europe, the defense authority in Visegrad Forum, defense cooperation in Visegrad, Young Leaders Forum, the transatlantic, Czech and Slovak transatlantic award, and a lot of other events. And this requires a high level of logistics and preparation. And I would like to ask you to join me in applauding of 85 young people who have prepared the conference for you with the average age of 22 years. Could you please everybody stand up? Who is in the organizing team that are there? These people did not sleep for several days and weeks to prepare for you this conference. So I think they deserve not only lunch after, after my speech, but also a little nap before the after party. Yeah? But let me thank also to all of our partners and supporters and everybody who has contributed to us. If we wouldn't have such a strong partnerships in Visegrad, in Europe, United States, and such a strong support from the business community, we wouldn't be able to pay the bills. So thanks for everybody who has contributed. And I'm looking forward for Globsec 2014 and for your participation. Let me say one more thing, and that's the last thing. The biggest thanks you can give to these young people is that you tweet, you post on Facebook, you blog and write. The more you do it, the more you make happy those young people who made this happen. So thank you very much once again. Looking forward to meet you next year. Thank you.